Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The pound will crash, unemployment and inflation will soar, and the UK economy could shrink by 8%. A worst-case scenario from the Bank of England if there's a disorderly no-deal Brexit. Although Governor Mark Carney added that banks had ample resources to withstand any major market disruption, and that the economy would start growing again by the end of 2023. Small comfort, perhaps, after the government's official analysis that under any Brexit scenario, Britain would end up worse off than if we'd stayed in the EU. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, reports.
A future portrait of Brexit Britain, a broad brush picture from the Treasury of the damage to our economy after we leave the EU, and the grim detail from the Bank of England as house prices crash, inflation soars and the economy tumbles if we fail to reach a deal. Theresa May is out putting a positive spin on her Brexit deal again today, but there's no spinning the numbers coming from her own Treasury and the Bank of England. And while economic analyses are always full of caution and caveats, particularly now with all the uncertainties around Brexit, there's no denying one central fact, that leaving the EU under any scenario leaves Britain and all of us worse off. The Chancellor was preparing the ground before the figures with a round of interviews, a Remainer himself, but one this morning in damage limitation mode.
Yes, it's true. If we are only looking at the economic benefits, remaining in the EU is a slightly better economic outcome than the Prime Minister's deal. But the Prime Minister's deal gives an outcome remarkably close to the benefits of staying in the European Union, the economic benefits, while having all the political benefits of being independent.
There was no actual Treasury scenario that modelled the Prime Minister's deal, but even the one that looks most like it shows the UK economy would continue to grow, yes, but be nearly 4% smaller in 15 years than if we'd stayed in the EU. The country around 100 billion poorer annually, with everyone £1,000 worse off. No deal is the worst case, with the economy more than 9% smaller, hitting the North East, West Midlands and Northern Ireland the hardest, while the car and pharmaceutical industries would be more than 20% smaller than had we remained. David Davis, the former Brexit secretary, had his own charts. Predictably, they didn't tally with the Chancellor's.
Forecasts are not facts. These are polemical projections. It's notable they haven't published the assumptions, what trade assumptions have got in there, and they're no different from the Project Fear forecasts that predate them. So I'm afraid this is the Treasury view put into numbers. Never confuse precision with accuracy.
Theresa May focused on one point in the analysis, that the economy would still grow despite the Brexit drag.
This analysis does not show that we'll be poorer in the future than we are today. No, it doesn't. It shows we'll be better off with this deal.
It's not hard to be the best deal if it's the only deal. By definition, therefore, Mr. Speaker, by definition, it's also the worst deal.
In a plastic packaging factory in Coventry, a town which voted to leave the EU, the gloomy predictions left them both defiant and bemused.
Yeah, I still would have voted leave. I do think that, they should make it clearer what the deal actually is.
Seems like that you're the only country from whole EU who managed to step up, to speak up to the European Union, saying, hey, we don't like that. So from that side, good. But maybe you could have found a better solution.
Because she's saying we've got a deal, but I don't understand what the deal is.
Our job is not to hope for the best, but to prepare for the worst.
As the factory workers headed home, up popped the Governor of the Bank of England with a harsh warning about the reality of a disorderly Brexit. The economy crashes by 8% in a single year as house prices tumble by a third and inflation soars to 6.5%.
By the end of 2023, GDP is more than 10% lower in the disorderly scenario compared to that May 2016 trend. Despite this sharp contraction in GDP, something that's bigger than happened during the financial crisis, unemployment rises to 7.5%, less than during the financial crisis. And that reflects the supply-driven nature of the downturn.
The Bank of England Governor there, and Siobhan joins me now. Siobhan, the economists have got it wrong many times before. Could Mark Carney and others have got it wrong today?
Well, funny you should say that. The minute he sat down not very long ago at the Bank of England there, Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg were simply dismissing these new predictions as more Project Fear. Certainly from the start of the day to the end of the day, Cathy, these numbers have looked very scary. Worth saying they're not forecasts, though. They are merely predictions based on different scenarios. The worst case, of course, being a no-deal scenario. But even in that case, the Governor of the Bank of England stresses that our banks, our financial system, could cope. Also worth noting, he points to one positive outcome, that if we do leave the EU with a very close relationship, not dissimilar to the one that we have now, that Brexit could actually add to UK GDP, to our growth by 2023. I'm not sure, though, Cathy, that there are many people who would agree with that prediction.
Well, this Treasury analysis had a few holes in, didn't it? Because it didn't, for example, run the slide rule specifically over Theresa May's deal.
Her own deal. Precisely. It also failed to predict what the backstop scenario might look like, which clearly they've been wrangling over for weeks. You might have expected to see an outcome modelling around that. But all the models, interestingly, did include the input of new trade deals, these much vaunted trade deals that are going to boost our growth in the years to come after we leave the EU. But when you look at the numbers, they actually add just a very minuscule amount, about 0.2% to our GDP in the next 15 years. So not very much at all.
Indeed. Siobhan, thanks very much. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mel Stride. I began by asking him if he was proud to be part of a government that promises to make people poorer.
I'm proud to be part of a government that, despite all the naysayers saying we would never negotiate a deal with the European Union, has gone out and done just that. This is a deal that is going to be good for the economy going forward, but also it's going to deliver on the fundamentals of what the referendum in 2016 told us the British people wanted.
And it's a deal that will make people poorer.
It's a deal that will put an end to free movement. It's a deal that will stop us sending vast sums of money to the EU. It's a deal that will allow us to get out there and enter into trading arrangements with other countries around the world. It will protect the integrity of the United Kingdom. So this is a good...
And it will make the British people poorer.
Well, we've just released some figures today to baseline and compare the deal with other possibilities, such as free trade agreements, such as no deal at all. And the deal is by far the most economically positive of those alternatives. And
but
you
it
say
will still make
hold on,
people
Cathy.
poorer.
Yes, because what you're saying is, well, you know, we could live in a world in which we hadn't decided to leave the European Union. Well, the decision was taken back in June 2016 that we should leave the EU, and that is what we're going to do.
Doesn't the government now have a responsibility to go back to the British people and say, OK, now that we've established that the deal we've put forward will make you poorer, we're going to give you a second chance to make sure that you're really sure you want to back this deal, and we're going to put it to a referendum?
No, I think that would be profoundly undemocratic to do that. We went out, and I say this as somebody who campaigned to remain, incidentally. We went out to the British people. We had the largest turnout of any electoral event in the history of our country, and the result was very clear, and that was that people voted to leave the EU. So that has to be our starting point.
Do you believe this analysis, or do you think it is Project Fear?
What I am satisfied of is that it has been properly looked at in an honest and in-depth way, without ministers, or certainly let alone the Treasury, interfering in any way at all. And this is the analysis that we have.
Just wondering what happened to the sunlit uplands. I mean, can you still see them?
Yeah, absolutely I can. Listen, if we get this deal agreed by Parliament, the whole mood music across the UK economy is going to change quite dramatically. Gone will be the uncertainty, gone will be the slowdown in investment decisions, gone will be those businesses out there that will be saying to themselves, do I hire somebody now or do I delay that decision? And we will move into a period of certainty, greater confidence. We've got that ability to have that deal that will deliver that. And what we don't want is to go and end up in a situation where we have a no deal, which would have a very detrimental effect.
And there are those who say that pigs will fly before you get Theresa May's deal through Parliament.
Well, they're probably the same people, Cathy, that said pigs will fly when we tried to get the Phase 1 agreement sorted out, the money with the EU, and we did that. And they're probably the same people that said pigs might fly when they said we'll never agree an implementation period with the EU, and we did that. And they're probably the same people that said pigs might fly if you think you're going to get a deal with the EU. Well, we've just done that.
Many pigs in the air. Mel Stride, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, after another bruising encounter at the dispatch box and another robust defence of her Brexit strategy, Mrs May flew to Glasgow as part of her efforts to sell her deal to voters, dropping in at a local factory to tell workers that the agreement would offer the chance of an unprecedented economic partnership with Europe. It was something of a flying visit, but our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins has been getting some local reaction.
This is the persuasion tour, the Prime Minister taking her message, we're told, directly to the people. In this case, the people at a number 10 organised event in a leather factory near Glasgow. So how did Theresa May's sales pitch go down in Scotland?
It's all about chemistry as well, as well as raw material.
Well, this chat is about leather.
Driving and automation, so one of the challenges we have.
She may well have spoken widely with workers here about her Brexit deal. But from the footage shared with us, we can't identify a conversation we could show you. And anyway, her line isn't changing.
People voted to leave, and I believe as politicians we should deliver that. We've negotiated a deal that delivers that Brexit and does it while protecting jobs, protecting livelihoods, protecting security and protecting our United Kingdom.
There was no trip to the coast for the Prime Minister, or indeed anywhere but here. Amid charges from her own party, she has sold out the fishing industry. She said this.
This is a deal that is right for Scotland and right for Scottish fishermen, because we'll take back control of our waters and ensure they have a bright future for Scottish fishing.
Theresa May wasn't knocking on doors today. She's visiting just a stone's throw away from you today. But we were. Do you think that she might just hop across from the factory there and knock on your door?
No.
What would Mr Galbraith say to the Prime Minister?
It's a dog's breakfast. We're making ourselves poorer and worse off. Why? The little Englander attitude, as far as I'm concerned.
It was indeed the day the government concluded its Brexit deal would do economic harm. Maybe a fatal blow in previous times, but not these.
I think she's doing a bloody good job, and if I would tell them to go and stuff it.
Mrs Bannerman doesn't believe the government's figures. The Chancellor has said today that the deal that she has is going to make us economically worse off.
Really?
Does that bother you?
It doesn't bother me because I don't believe it.
Hello. And neither does Mr Patterson. So even the Chancellor saying it, you don't believe it?
I don't believe him at all.
Why not?
I just don't believe that the politicians at the moment are telling us the truth.
But why would he not tell you
They're
the
too
truth?
busy stabbing each other in the back.
What car you get down?
Hello.
Sorry for that.
Ewan, though, would really have relished a couple of minutes with the PM.
I tell her it's been already proven that it's going to be detrimental to Scotland, so I don't know why she's pushing ahead with it. Despite all the parties that are elected to represent Scotland are going against it, so why does she continue to push forward that against Scotland as well?
Well, there she goes. Theresa May can now tick off Scotland from her UK tour. A single stop. She's been here less than 2 hours. What was the point? You may wonder. The real job of persuading was always going to take place elsewhere. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Bridge of Weir.
Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister, the Bank of England's warnings that the pound will plunge, we'd be plunged into a recession if there's a no deal. The fact that you're refusing to back Theresa May's deal makes a no-deal scenario much more likely. Isn't that irresponsible?
Well, I don't accept that false choice. I mean, I've been warning about the catastrophe of a no deal for the last 2.5 years. I was saying no deal would be catastrophic in the days when Theresa May was saying that no deal was better than a bad deal. She's now trying to say to people that we either have to accept her bad deal or face the prospect of a no deal. That's not true. There are other options. There's the option, the compromise option that the Scottish Government has proposed for the last couple of years of staying permanently inside the single market and customs union, or of course the option of another vote. And what I've said very clearly is that if the opposition in the House of Commons is going to vote down that deal, and it looks likely, and I think that's right, because it's a bad deal for Scotland, a bad deal for the UK, then we also have the obligation and the responsibility to come together around an alternative, and the SNP will certainly play its part in doing that.
OK, and your alternative, you've made clear, would be staying in the single market and a customs union, a kind of Norway plus deal, as you've put it. Can you give Theresa May a commitment now that the SNP would vote for a Norway plus deal if she put it on the table?
Well, we've said all along that we would support as a compromise, and let me stress that it's not our preferred position. Our preferred position is to remain in the EU, but we've said all along that if that compromise was on the table, we would support it. But instead of trying to reach compromise, Theresa May has insisted on imposing on herself red lines that have constrained her options. Of course, there is also the option of another vote. Theresa May is touring the country right now, not spending very long in any one place, as we saw in your film. But if she wants the electorate to judge this deal to be the people of the country, then perhaps she should give them a vote on the matter.
Well, it's
she
interesting.
seems to be very reluctant to do that.
Well, it's interesting that you're so keen on a second vote, because if you won a referendum on Scottish independence, you'd surely think it was outrageous if then your opponent said, let's put it back to the people for another vote.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is circumstances have changed in the last 2 years. Whatever people voted for in 2016, they didn't vote for the chaos that we are now seeing and now experiencing. The government has failed to get its act together. It's failed to negotiate a deal that is in the interests of the country. And if Parliament can't agree that deal, then it is reasonable to look again at the principle of whether the UK should leave the EU or remain within the EU.
And if there was, and wait a minute, if there was chaos after a Scottish independence referendum, a couple of years after that, would you be content to see that put back to the people?
Well, you see, there's a real contrast here that is very obvious for people between the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 and the Brexit vote of 2016. In 2016, we had the infamous lie on the side of a bus. In 2014, we had a 800-plus page document setting out the detail of Scottish independence, setting out very honestly and frankly some of the compromises and trade-offs that would require to be made, for example, a currency union that not everybody agreed with. So we were upfront and honest about some of the implications of Scottish independence. People knew what they were voting for.
Well, and Theresa May would say,
and that is very, very different from the Brexit vote in 2016.
Theresa May would say she's put out nearly as many pages on her deal, and yet you want to stay in a single market and a customs union, and you want to leave the common fisheries policy. I mean, aren't you, just like Boris Johnson, guilty of wanting to have your cake and eat it?
Well, of course, EFTA countries that are in the single market and not in the EU are not in the common fisheries policy, but in that deal that Theresa May struck at the weekend, I mean, clearly the way is being paved for another sellout of Scottish fishermen. But you talked about the hundreds of pages of the withdrawal deal, and there's lots in that, of course, to pore over. But the document that tells us what the future relationship between the UK and the EU is going to be amounts to 26 pages. There's a line in it that says there's a spectrum of options for the future. Voting for this in the House of Commons for MPs would be voting for a blindfold Brexit. It would be voting to leave the EU come the 29th of March next year without any idea at all of what the future relationship is going to be. Of course, what we see from the analysis published today is that all of these options, when the UK leaves the EU, if the UK leaves the EU, will make the country poorer. So Theresa May has failed. She's failed to bring back a deal that can unite people and that can attract support. And I think it is now time for her to look at the alternatives. And if she won't do it, the House of Commons should force her to.
OK. No deal is worst for the UK. The Bank of England and the Treasury made that clear today. But actually, you could argue it's best for the SNP, because the chaos that would come out of a no deal would enable you to justify a second independence referendum, wouldn't it?
Well, you see, this is where, you know, I have to say I'm very different from Boris Johnson, because I don't agree with that cynical approach to politics. I don't want to see the UK damage itself. I don't want to see that for its own sake. But equally, whatever the constitutional future of Scotland turns out to be, and I hope and expect that that will be as an independent country, it's always going to be in Scotland's interest for the rest of the UK to succeed, for the rest of the UK to have as close as possible a relationship with the European Union. So in all sincerity, I've put forward compromise options over the last couple of years with the best interest, not just of Scotland, but with the whole UK at heart. And what we found in those 2 years is that Theresa May has been unwilling to listen. She comes to Scotland today, but she has ignored completely Scotland's voice over these past couple of years, ignored the 62% vote to remain and ignored all attempts at compromise, and in doing so actually has immeasurably strengthened the case for Scotland to be an independent country.
OK, I'd love to ask you when, but we've run out of time. First Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jackie.
Well, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Gary, how will today's economic forecasts affect Mrs May's chances of getting her deal through?
You heard Siobhan earlier in the programme talking about how the most prominent Brexiteers are saying they don't believe a word of this and it's not going to budge them. But other people who've come out against Theresa May's plan, other MPs, it's very difficult to see how they necessarily budge between now and the vote in just under 2 weeks' time. There's been an awful lot of them coming out and saying they're going to vote against it. This might be a function of social media. Statistically, it looks as though more people are more defiant early on these days, but it is really difficult for them to turn. What you can imagine it doing is turning public opinion. Theresa May seems to be doing quite well with public opinion right now. She's done quite well in the past, remember, and it's gone away from her. But right now, they seem to be on her side. How does that translate in under 2 weeks into a Commons vote? Quite difficult to see.
And on to Labour. I mean, today they're pretty angry about the government's refusal to publish the legal advice on this Brexit deal, aren't they?
That's right. Keir Starmer said in the House of Commons that he thought the government was in contempt of Parliament because it hadn't done what Parliament had voted for it to do and bring the full legal opinion into the public domain, publish it. Now, the Speaker, interestingly, turned around and sounded pretty interested in pursuing this. He said he'd make a statement on it quite soon. In theory, that could mean he triggers a vote in the House of Commons. Technically, that could then lead to a Privileges Committee inquiry by MPs, and then, potentially, technically, you could have a member of the government, maybe the Attorney General, maybe the effective Deputy Prime Minister, David Lidington, maybe even the Prime Minister, suspended from the House of Commons for contempt. Now, you'd scratch your head and think that's unthinkable, but right now an awful lot of unthinkable things seem to be happening.
And is there movement today on Labour's position on a second referendum or not?
Intriguing moment. John McDonnell turned around, Shadow Chancellor, and said in an interview that if after what he expects to be the defeat of Theresa May's plan in the Commons, there is not a general election, which Labour would obviously try very hard to get. If that didn't happen, well, then he said a second referendum was, quotes, inevitable. This led to a lot of iPhone activity and quite coarse language, I'm told, amongst some people in Labour High Command, wondering what exactly John McDonnell was up to. He issued his own statement and gave another interview saying, I wasn't saying anything out of the ordinary, I've been slightly misjudged or misquoted. Labour policy has not changed, but an awful lot of people are sniffing that John McDonnell is either trying to keep the right side of Labour membership, the right side of voters, both of those things, or maybe even trying to shift Labour Party policy. This is one to watch.
Gary, thanks very much.
The Bank of England is warning of an immediate economic crash if the UK leaves the European Union without a deal. The bank's forecast is of a shock to growth more damaging than the financial crisis of 2008, with the economy shrinking by 8%. The governor, Mark Carney, says interest rates would rise, house prices would fall and unemployment would increase. The warning comes as the government publishes its own economic analysis, suggesting Britain will be poorer under all Brexit scenarios than if it remained in the European Union. Well, in a moment, we'll have the view from Westminster, but first, here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Enter Brexit centre stage, a man with a warning. Leaving the EU without a deal could trigger an economic crash worse than the one that followed the financial crisis.
We've constructed a sort of worst case, no deal, no transition Brexit scenario where you have a series of events which include frictions at the border, difficulties at ports, sharp moves in financial markets so that it costs much more for people to borrow and businesses to borrow, a series of events that all happen at the same time.
Now, this is not a prediction or a forecast, merely a possibility. In the bank's worst-case scenario, GDP is down 8% in 1 year. House prices down 30%. Unemployment nearly doubles to 7.5%, and prices rise by 6.5%.
It's in these marbled halls that Bank of England economists peer into their crystal balls to look at what could happen in the future. And as we've seen, some of the scenarios are pretty grim. But the bank says it is not here to scare us. In fact, it's there to reassure us that if we do get a no deal, no transition Brexit, which creates a financial emergency, the bank will be ready.
But is the real economy ready? The bank says 80% of small businesses have done no planning for a no-deal scenario. It's an outcome this furniture maker from High Wycombe says he'd like to avoid.
For us, we would like to get on with it. Certainly a no deal would be difficult, because I think it would just increase the damage to consumer confidence. Presumably it will damage the strength of the pound, which just makes our life more expensive. And I think it just simplicity would be good for us.
This worst case is only one unlikely scenario. Others analysed include staying in the EU, that's the orange line at the top. A new trade deal, similar to the one proposed by the Prime Minister, is underneath, with a no-deal, disorderly Brexit at the bottom. Remember, this bank report was requested by MPs who asked a simple question. Does the Bank of England think the UK will be better or worse off than it predicted before the referendum?
It's, in some respects, it's very simple. For a period of time, if we reduce the degree to which we can trade with our largest trading partner, the economy has to undergo an adjustment. During that period of time, it is likely, all things being equal, that the economy will grow less rapidly.
The government's own analysis reached a similar conclusion today, but it says delivering Brexit requires and is worth the economic compromise. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, the government has also released an economic analysis of what leaving the European Union could mean for the economy, and it claims the UK will be poorer under any form of Brexit compared with staying in the EU. Now, the review suggests a deal similar to the agreement negotiated by Theresa May with Brussels would leave the economy over the next 15 years 3.9% smaller than if the UK stayed in the EU. But the analysis shows a no-deal Brexit would see growth hit by 9.3% over the same period. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
This isn't a general election, even though it looks a bit like it. The Prime Minister's Brexit deal is the candidate. MPs are the voters. She's hopeful the government's numbers today show her compromise is better than nothing.
It shows that the deal we've negotiated with the European Union is the best deal available for jobs and the economy, that also delivers, honours the referendum.
There are lots of possibilities that today's statistics just don't and cannot include. But the Brexit campaign certainly didn't say the economy would slow down on the side of a bus. The Chancellor this morning was remarkably clear.
If we are only looking at the economic benefits, remaining in the EU is a slightly better economic outcome than the Prime Minister's deal. But the Prime Minister's deal gives an outcome remarkably close to the benefits of staying in.
It might seem bizarre to hear a Chancellor admit the government's own policy would see the country poorer. But what number 11 is saying today is what most calculations have always said, that the economy will still grow after Brexit, but a bit more slowly than if we stay in the EU. What number 10 is arguing is that under the deal they've brokered, the economy would see much less turmoil and disturbance than if we walked away with no deal and no agreement. But Brexit itself has always been about much more than the cash. Labour right now is committed to trying to stop the Prime Minister's deal. Not stopping Brexit, at least not yet. Are they tiptoeing to another referendum?
The numbers just aren't there, and it's causing insecurity and division unnecessarily.
Do you accept, though, by voting down the deal, that you will be creating more turmoil, even if only in the short term?
I don't accept that. We want a deal that will protect jobs in the economy. If we can't achieve that, the government can't achieve that, we think we can. If the government can't achieve that, we should have a general election. If that's not possible, we'll be calling upon the government then to join us in a public vote. That's the sequence, I think, that will inevitably go through over this period.
So it would be inevitable that if a vote of no confidence didn't bring down the government in a general election, it is inevitable, to use that word that you just used, there would be another vote.
Well, that's right. We've said our policy is if we can't get a general election, well, then the other option, which we've kept on the table, is a people's vote, a public vote.
Nothing seems inevitable round here right now. More than 2 years since the referendum, getting Parliament and the public on side for any one plan is far from easy. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, while Theresa May was in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was criticising her Brexit deal, saying the Prime Minister cannot promote opportunity when economic analyses suggest her proposals will make everyone poorer. The Scottish Government published its own projections yesterday, saying Brexit would cost every person in Scotland more than £1,600 by 2030 when compared with EU membership. Here's our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith.
The Edinburgh Beer Factory is a small, young company with big ambitions to rapidly expand their exports. At the moment, they don't yet know if Brexit's a problem or if it could provide new opportunities.
Actually, some of our early sales have been to Japan, Hong Kong, Canada, so we're not entirely tied to the EU. That said, the EU is the single biggest exporting bloc.
If Theresa May is to convince Scottish business her deal will work for them, she needs to persuade people like these brewers. New opportunities to sell beer or anything else to the rest of the world beyond the EU is what the Prime Minister wants to sell to Scottish businesses. But if the economy here slows down, then that'll really affect companies like this one, which sell most of their product in the UK. Visiting a leather factory outside Glasgow, Theresa May insisted her deal does take Scotland's interests into account. And she tried to reassure some of the factory's employees she met that it will protect Scottish jobs and business. But Scotland's First Minister says that is simply denying reality.
I'm struggling to believe that the Prime Minister is in Scotland or anywhere else in the UK today talking about economic opportunities when her own government has published modelling showing that every outcome of Brexit will make the whole country poorer. I mean, it just beggars belief.
It is hard to convince businesses like the beer factory that they will benefit from Brexit when the Treasury's own analysis forecasts a slowing economy. And the Scottish Government predicts leaving the EU could hit Scotland harder than the rest of the UK. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Edinburgh.
Well, our business editor Simon Jack is here. These are incredible figures from the Bank of England. How credible are they?
I can't stress this enough, Clive. These are not predictions or forecasts. These are just possibilities. Lots of possibilities that happen. Of all the possibilities you could look at, this is the worst. And the governor did say today, but having said that, the probability of this outcome has gone up a little bit because of some of the parliamentary gridlock you heard Laura talking about there. Now, they are always, other people say, look, they're always wrong. These are very difficult things to model. They're very complicated. There's lots of moving parts. But the Bank of England has hundreds of economists. They've got all the data. They've got historical experience. So the fact that they're not always right doesn't mean they're pure guesswork. They are serious bits of work where people put a lot of effort in and say these are some of the likely outcomes. I think ultimately, though, we've had a little bit of this before. People will say before, during and since the referendum, we've had some dread warnings about what would happen. Will this make any difference? It'll be interesting to see whether this latest and these rather scary figures, as you say, a worse recession than the one we saw after the financial crisis, will get any traction with MPs. Of course, it's down to them now to vote.
OK, Simon, many thanks. Simon Jack there.
Back to the business of Brexit now, and house prices down 30%, the pound down 25%, unemployment and inflation both up. Welcome to the no-deal Brexit scenario set out this afternoon by the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. Not a forecast, you understand, as he made clear, but a worst-case assessment in the event of what he called a disorderly Brexit. His remarks have triggered some pretty spiky reaction.
North East England voted resoundingly to leave the EU. At this factory in Peterlee, the talk has been of Brexit ever since. And opinion is still divided on whether we're doing the right thing.
It looks like it's totally messed up. We'll be stuck in it now. We could be even worse off than we were in the first place.
I just wish we'd just get on with it now. I just wish someone said, right, we're leaving, that's it. Sign the piece of paper and let's see what happens.
For this business, Brexit thus far hasn't been a disaster, but they're preparing for no deal, which might be. Some argue no deal, no problem, but the Bank of England takes a very different view. Its vision of what happens if Britain leaves the EU abruptly in March is pretty horrific. In the bank's disorderly Brexit scenario, Britain would head straight into recession. GDP would fall by up to 8%, the sharpest decline since the 1920s. The unemployment rate would almost double to 7.5%. A slump in the pound would trigger price rises. Inflation would hit 6.5%, and the bank would have to hike interest rates to contain it. Bank rate would rise to 5.5%. The message here, Britain isn't ready for no deal.
The country is not yet fully prepared for a cliff edge Brexit. Surveys suggest that less than half of businesses have initiated contingency plans for no deal, and less than a fifth of small businesses have done so.
The Bank of England points out this is a worst-case scenario, an assessment of what might happen rather than a forecast of what will. The bank makes a series of extremely negative but plausible assumptions. It imagines severe disruption at the border, that net migration goes into reverse, that the population begins to shrink, and it assumes that the British government fails to negotiate a single new trade deal before 2023. The good news is the Bank of England believes the banking system is prepared for the worst. Its stress tests show our 7 biggest lenders would survive a disorderly Brexit without falling into the arms of the taxpayer. The Bank of England was asked to carry out this analysis by Parliament, but the integrity of it has been challenged and the timing of its release, so close to the meaningful vote, has been criticised.
Well, I think this is part of a pattern that's emerged over the last few years where the bank's independence from government, which is a very valuable commodity, has been eroded in different ways, and its credibility as an independent institution, I think, has been eroded alongside that.
Back in the northeast, they're hoping for frictionless trade post-Brexit. The Bank of England's analysis suggests such an outcome would improve our growth prospects. Unfortunately, the EU has more or less ruled it out. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Well, it wasn't just Mr Carney who was suggesting how Brexit could affect the economy. The government produced its own set of figures for different Brexit options, but with a similar conclusion. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister took her nationwide tour, selling the deal she's negotiated to Scotland.
The Prime Minister is taking her Brexit roadshow to all corners of the UK. Today she was in a leather factory in Scotland. But if the idea is to appeal directly to the public, her own government analysis, which makes clear any form of Brexit makes us worse off, hasn't made her sales pitch any easier.
Well, the economic analysis that the government has published today shows that the deal that we've negotiated with the European Union is the best deal available for jobs and the economy, that honours the referendum and also enables us to take advantage of the great opportunities that come from Brexit, from leaving the European Union.
The analysis suggests that under a deal closest to the government's proposal, the economy would grow more slowly than staying in the EU. But like the Bank of England forecasts, it would take a much more serious hit under a no-deal scenario. So does the Chancellor think remaining makes better economic sense?
Yes, it's true. If we are only looking at the economic benefits, remaining in the EU is a slightly better economic outcome than the Prime Minister's deal. But the Prime Minister's deal gives an outcome remarkably close to the benefits of staying in the European Union.
Committed Brexiters feel this is just a rerun of referendum scare stories.
I'm afraid, as I said, we must be ready for Project Fear 2.0. In a desperate attempt to reverse the result of the 2016 referendum, we're undoubtedly going to hear the most hair-raising stories and improbable forecasts. Let's remind those who might waver that we've heard all this before.
In just 13 days' time, MPs in here will vote on the Brexit deal, with nothing to suggest the government is any closer to winning. This evening, Labour made their backing a second referendum sound much more likely.
And if Parliament can't decide, is it inevitable that we're heading towards a second referendum?
If we can't get a general election, yes, we'll be moving towards that consideration of another referendum. We'll be forced into that situation by the incompetence of the government and the failure, basically, of people to recognise that actually the Conservative Party is never going to be able to negotiate a deal effectively in the way that we could.
And in that case, will Labour be campaigning for Remain?
Well, that'll be decided democratically by our party. We campaigned for Remain before, I voted for Remain, and that'll be a debate that we'll have.
It's a shift that would open up clear blue water between the two main parties on Brexit. With the country's future course so uncertain, it's going to be a momentous few weeks in Westminster. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
Well, while Mrs May was fishing for support for her Brexit deal in Renfrewshire in Scotland, we went to find out what the Scottish fishing industry thinks about it. Well, the industry there is worth £1.4 billion to the UK economy, and it employs more than 11,000 people. The Prime Minister has said that after we leave the EU, we will also leave its common fisheries policy, which at the moment allows European boats to land over half of all fish caught in British waters. But our fishermen and women also trade trade freely with Europe, with around 70% of exports going to the EU, making whatever future deal is agreed with Brussels important for the whole industry.
Nestled into the misty hills of Argyll on Scotland's west coast is the fishing village of Tarbert. Life here revolves around these fertile waters on Loch Fyne, where the trawler's work is hard, but the catch is highly prized. So prized is it, the fishermen here wanted a Brexit that would give them greater control, but the deal Theresa May's proposing leaves them worried EU countries will try to get access to their fish.
You can see that with a comment that President Macron has made from France. They're going to back the fishermen to the hilt and they're going to get access. He's more or less said that he will have access to for his fishermen.
So does that mean that you feel let down about the common fisheries policy?
We do feel let down about that. We do. Because that says to me that we're not coming out.
Is that what you voted for?
I voted to come out the CFP. That's why I voted to leave, and along with all the other fishermen.
The Loch Fyne produce is among Scotland's most valuable exports, but 80% of it goes to just 3 countries, France, Italy and Spain. So their business relies on Theresa May striking a Brexit balance that protects access to British waters, but also protects their access to those European markets.
We don't want that product to arrive foul, rotten, not alive, or
It loses its value.
Yeah, it loses its value. We don't get paid for that. When that arrives, if that's not in prime condition, it's no use to our customers, because what are they going to do with it?
So you need a frictionless border for
Yeah,
things like
yeah, we need the straight line. You know, no stops through the Channel Tunnel. At the moment, where our stuff goes to France, and it's within the customer within 2-3 hours of getting to France.
Okay. This summer, the so-called scallop wars in the English Channel showed just how hard French fishermen are willing to fight. But there's a feeling here that the British government hasn't fought quite as hard for the Scottish fishing industry.
We're talking at the moment about Northern Ireland having a different deal on tariffs or having no tariffs. Well, we would have tariffs. Northern Irish fishermen fish in the Clyde, they fish the same stocks. It definitely puts our market at a disadvantage.
It was Scotland's fishermen who believed Brexit was their ship coming in. Now the trawlermen of Loch Fyne have no faith in the Prime Minister's plan. They were supposed to be Theresa May's Brexit base here, but it's bad news for any captain when the crew questions her ability to steer the ship. Peter Smith, News at 10, Tarbert.
Well, we can go back to our political correspondent Romilly Weeks, who's in Westminster for us tonight. Some details emerging there, Romilly, about the meaningful vote on December the 11th.
Yes, that's right. We already know that the 11th of December is the big Brexit red letter day for that vote, but we've got some detail on what's going to be happening in the run-up to that day. And if you think you've heard a lot about Brexit so far, you ain't heard anything yet, because we're going to have 5 days of debate next week and going into the following week of up to 8 hours every day. There will be 6 amendments allowed to be selected by the Speaker, who has quite a lot of power in this. Labour has already said that they will be tabling an amendment opposing the government's deal and also opposing a no-deal scenario. We can expect other amendments on a Norway-style option and probably on a second referendum or people's vote too. The government had tried to suggest that amendments wouldn't be heard until after the meaningful vote, but they seem to have lost that argument, which could actually work in their favour if it shows that there isn't a majority for any other option either. But that doesn't change the fact that the government is looking at this point at a very difficult task in trying to secure any majority for that main vote on their Brexit deal.
An absolute marathon ahead. Romilly, thank you very much indeed for that. And Robert Peston has the Business Secretary Greg Clark on his programme right after the news tonight. He says he'll fight to the end to prevent a no-deal Brexit.
For some, the economic reports published today are just the latest stage in Project Fear. The British people didn't believe the forecast made before the referendum, so the argument goes, this is just another attempt to reverse the decision. But others may find the projections sobering. Although the economy will continue to grow, according to the government's analysis, the country will be economically poorer under any form of Brexit compared with staying in the EU. I'm joined to analyse the analysis by our experts, Helen Thomas, Chris Cook and Nick Watt. And let's start with you, Helen. What is the detail of what the government modelled today?
So let's take a look. These are just some of the scenarios that the government looked at. These all reflect the hit to GDP after 15 years compared to remaining in the EU. These numbers, I would say, all assume that freedom of movement ends, so you get zero net migration from Europe. Most severe on the left, no deal, 9.3% hit. Least impact to the economy is Chequers, which, remember, was talking about frictionless trade. We don't have an exact replica of the current withdrawal agreement and the proposed future relationship, but the closest we've got is next to Chequers, and that's a 3.9% hit, again, relative to where you'd be if you remained. Now, what this spectrum tells us, and we've had two independent reports that have come up with a similar conclusion this week, is that there is an economic cost to leaving the EU, no matter how you do it. And the less alignment you have with the EU, or the greater the sovereignty, if you want to think about it that way, so the further you move to the left, the greater that economic cost. And we can add two more options just for fun. EEA, the Norway option, which we've heard a lot about, and Chequers, but assuming no change to migration policies. So those effectively keep freedom of movement, more alignment, smaller economic cost.
So scary numbers, but what about what the Brexiteers are saying? The likes of David Davis said today, this is just Project Fear Mark II.
I think what's different is that we now have a much better understanding than pre the referendum about what that no deal bar means and the problems involved in it. And I think people have done a lot more thinking about the different options in between remaining and that no deal outcome. Now, you can quibble with what the Treasury's modelled, what the government's modelled and how they've modelled it, and people will. But I don't think this idea of a trade-off is actually terribly controversial. And also, these are long-term forecasts. They're inherently uncertain, but we're not talking about sort of short-term pain. In that vein, though, the Bank of England today came out with some short-term forecasts for what a sort of disorderly no deal could mean. They were pretty extreme, talking about a worse recession than after the financial crisis, house price falls of 30%, inflation going to 6.5%, and that has caused much more of a Project Fear type pushback.
You buy into that?
Well, I think in fairness to the bank, when you look at what they were doing, it was explicitly an absolute worst-case scenario. And so all their assumptions, more negative trade assumptions than the government, sort of no cooperation with the EU on things like product standards, interest rates rising rather than being cut to support the economy, it was designed to be an extreme scenario.
And Chris, this is perfect territory for you to explain it all. In the government's analysis, is it feasible?
So I think when you look at the individual sort of scenarios that they've looked through, the original government work, there are things in them you can quibble about everything. And there's one in particular I would quibble with, which is on Helen's chart, the EEA option, which is the one that is one of the most economically benign of the Brexit options. That's something that's been talked about a lot recently, the Norway option, staying in. The thing is, the reason why the EEA is relatively economically benign is because it means that we retain all of the most of the European Union's standards, which will mean that trading goods in particular find it really easy to go back and forth. We'd also be able to keep things like financial services, but you'd still have to have customs controls. That's why there's a hit. The thing is, if we have customs controls, the European Union won't buy it because that will mean a border in Northern Ireland. The only EEA model that's really plausible on offer is one with some kind of customs arrangement, probably a customs union. If we have EEA plus a customs union, that takes away the thing that the Treasury thinks is causing the hit. So that's, if you like, a pessimistic view of the EEA. And given that the EEA has proponents in Parliament, maybe that's something to think about in the coming weeks.
And Nick?
Well,
political reaction?
Yeah, you're talking about Project Fear. In the Daily Telegraph tonight, Jacob Rees-Mogg is, in response to that Bank of England report, is talking about Project Hysteria. And the reason why the Brexiteers are so angry about this is they're saying, how can we trust the Bank of England and the Treasury when the figures that they put out during the referendum did not materialise? Now, Theresa May has always had some sympathy, being quite sceptical of this forecasting. But I have to say, in the Treasury, they are finding this quite helpful to help them prepare for avoiding a no-deal scenario if Theresa May's Brexit plan is voted down by Parliament. And I do know that senior civil servants at the very highest levels are beginning to have sleepless nights because what they fear is that we may sleepwalk into no deal. So look, earlier today I spoke to the Treasury Minister, Mel Stride, and I began by asking him how on earth anyone could believe any of these figures after their performance in the referendum.
Well, these are figures that have actually been put together right across Whitehall, so all departments have actually fed into these numbers. And what they're doing, Nick, is they're providing an estimate of the impact of the deal that we have negotiated with the EU and various other possibilities, including a no deal. And what they show is that of the alternatives, the deal is by far economically the best one available.
Were you surprised when you read these figures with that fundamental point?
Right.
The UK will be worse off outside the EU.
If you're going to move from an entirely frictionless customs unions, member of the single market arrangement that we have at the present to something that has a bit more friction in it and various other elements in it that were not there before, then it's not surprising if the economy may be impacted as a consequence. But the reality is that the decision has been taken to leave. We honour that decision. A responsible government therefore has a duty to go out and get the best possible deal for our country, which we have on the economy, as well as delivering on an end to free movement, sending lots of money over to the EU, being able to go out and conduct our own trade deals as a sovereign nation. And that's what this deal delivers.
This is going to make it much more difficult for the Prime Minister to win the meaningful vote in the Commons, isn't it?
I think quite the reverse. I think what the figures are underscoring is the quite sensible argument that the deal has to be compared to the alternatives. And the alternative includes potentially having no deal at all.
You've got people like Michael Fallon, you've got people like Sir Robert Sims. These are loyalists saying, I can't vote for this deal. You saying that the Prime Minister's going to win. Don't you feel a bit like Chemical Alley?
No, I don't. What I feel like is somebody who knows that we have a deal that is on the table, that if we can get around this deal, get it over the line, that it will be very positive for our country. It'll safeguard the economy compared to the alternative, which is no deal at all, and all the downsides of that and the difficulties of that. This is a good deal.
Now, the Labour Party is warming up to this idea of another referendum. Isn't this just a gift to those people who want to have another referendum?
Well, I suppose anybody who wants to have another referendum, to hear anybody else saying that they agree with them is something that they will feel good about. But look, this is about democracy, and this is about a decision that was taken in 2016, when incidentally I was on the losing side of the argument. But the reality is that in a referendum in which more people voted than have ever voted in the history of our country, a decision was taken, and that decision must be respected.
But isn't there a real problem of sort of trust in politics today? I mean, just today you'd have been in the House of Commons. The government is refusing to publish the full legal advice that took you to this Brexit deal after MPs voted for that actual thing to happen, and we're just going to get a summary. Well, that's not very good on trust.
Okay, well, this is a matter for the Attorney General, and I know that the Attorney General will shortly be making a statement to Parliament, so I'm not going to start prejudging what he may be about to say on that matter, other than to say that I'm absolutely certain that the government will, of course, comply with the will of Parliament.
Mel Stride, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mel Stride speaking to Nick earlier. Nick's still here because for those close watchers of the minutiae of Brexit developments, and at Newsnight we proudly count ourselves amongst them, today's Labour Shadow Chancellor appeared to inch his party towards calling for a second referendum. This is what the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, told the BBC today.
We want a deal that will protect jobs in the economy. If we can't achieve that, the government can't achieve that, we think we can. If the government can't achieve that, we should have a general election.
Which you know
as well as I do. It's very difficult to
do
because of the nature of the legislation that David Cameron brought forward. If that's not possible, we'll be calling upon the government then to join us in a public vote. And again, it's difficult to judge this at each stage, but that's the sequence I think that will inevitably go through over this period.
I mean, Nick, it's inch by inch, but is this a change from Labour?
It did feel like a bit of a shifting gear by John McDonnell, because until now he sounded rather neutral on the idea of having a second referendum. But in that interview with Laura Kuenssberg, he talked about how that could be inevitable if he doesn't get what he wants, which is a general election. And then last night in the Guardian event, he talked about how a Remain option should be on the ballot paper. He'd been much more careful on that before. But this is highly contentious in the Labour Party. I understood that this was raised in the Shadow Cabinet meeting today. Ian Lavery, the Labour chairman, I understand, said, look, we've got to be really careful about talking about this. This will go down very badly in some of our working class communities. And it's interesting tonight with ITN, John McDonnell has been much more cautious in the language that he's been using, talking about no change in policy. What he wants, first of all, is a general election. And this is about what happens if he doesn't get that. And I think there's a feeling in the John McDonnell circle that, in a sense, he's been a victim of trying to be open, trying not to close doors, and look what happens.
And in big picture terms, I mean, does it make a second referendum more likely?
Well, what the scenario that we're talking about probably is if Theresa May's Brexit plan is voted down on December the 11th and Parliament comes back to it, then it may well be, possibly on free votes, that MPs would have votes on a series of options. You would, for example, maybe have a vote on the Norway option you were talking about. I'm not sure how that would pass because Jeremy Corbyn is opposed to that. There might be a Brexiteer motion to sort of knock out the Northern Ireland backstop. I don't think that would pass. Then you could well have the second referendum one. Again, I'm not sure how that could pass because there are a significant number of Labour MPs and Conservative MPs who don't like it. Strangely, the one option that might get the highest level of support is Jeremy Corbyn's one, which is permanent membership of a customs union. But getting the highest level of support doesn't necessarily mean that it will pass. They might all be rejected, which is why, as I was saying earlier, those civil servants are worried that we may just sleepwalk into no deal.
Thanks, Nick. And we're joined now by Peter Dowd, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And Peter Dowd, I mean, we've seen, if we look at the economics, the economic news that's come out today, all that analysis. I mean, it's May's deal, or a deal that's very similar, that is the best financial option of all the Brexit options. I mean, you'd accept that, surely?
Well, it's an option that she's been trying to sort out for the past 2 years, so as far as I'm concerned, it isn't the best option that would be available for us. But you can't start from where we are. You have to take it from where we started. And we've arrived at this position, and it's not the best of positions that we could have been in.
But it's the only option, it's the only deal, she's saying, that we can get. And it's the least worst option.
Well, that's her opinion. That's why we've been saying that...
Well, government analysis... Bank of England potentially.
Well, yes, but that's the whole point that we've been saying. First and foremost, step aside the issue about a general election next time, but step aside. Have a general election if we can't get a decent deal, a better deal than the one we've got, which is similar to Labour's 6 tests. And if we can't get a general election, well, the potential for moving on to the option of a people's vote, another referendum. I see this as a sequence. There's always a danger, you used the word minutiae before, there's always a danger you get into the minutiae and the syntax and the semantics of it.
What about what Nick was talking about, that people are fearful we're going to fall into a no deal? I mean, the risks of no deal are so high, it seems, that if you're trying to protect people from harm, which presumably you have a responsibility to do, you've got to act in the national interest. And the only way is if Parliament passes something that protects the economy, and that is the May deal?
Well, what we've proposed actually today is making it clear that we will not support anything which delivers a no deal. So we've been absolutely clear about that. We'll take all the options forward to stop that happening. We're absolutely clear and unambiguous about that when we have the 5-day debate and the vote in Parliament.
Would you accept that we won't get a general election, which I know is what you want?
Well, no, I don't necessarily accept that. Again, it's an option, and the danger in situations like this, you have a sequence, and you try to say, here are the hurdles that we have, and we have to come up against those hurdles as we arrive at them. But yes, we can. We could get a general election. Yes, I prefer one.
And if you won't accept no deal, and you won't accept the May deal, what do you think you can get through, or are you really now just focused on general election? Or potentially
well, I think the government have had a chance for the past 2 years, pretty lamentably, to get a deal that we would find acceptable, that would fit our 6 tests, and so we would take over and do negotiations, and I believe the negotiations we would take on the basis of those 6 tests would be a much more productive and much more positive outcome for the country. And that's what we've been saying for the best part of 2 years, and we'll continue to say that.
And do you accept there aren't the numbers, the parliamentary numbers, to get a second referendum?
Well, I don't know. That's the point. We'd have to again cross that bridge when we come to it, but that's a possibility. I can't guarantee.
There is significant opposition in your own
party.
Well,
that may well be the case.
And with your voters.
Well, yes, but I think in the context of trying to get the best deal for the country, we've kept that option open. And that seems to me to be the most sensible and pragmatic thing to do.
But it's a charade if you're unlikely to get it.
Well, it isn't a charade because it isn't a charade. That's why we're saying we want to go through the sequence, through those sequences, step aside, have a general election, possibly have a... We can't absolutely guarantee that there'll be a vote, but we would push for one if necessary.
But you're talking about things that aren't going to happen. Well, most likely as we all slip into no deal.
Well, no, and that's why we're absolutely determined that we will not vote for any option that is going to deliver a no deal. We're absolutely clear and unambiguous about that.
But it's a default.
I don't know what you mean it's a default. Our position is clear. We believe that having a no deal is the worst of all options, and therefore we're not prepared to accept that.
Peter Dowd, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. But how will the apparent hardening up of the Labour Party's position on the second referendum play in some of its heartlands, in places where the majority voted to leave the EU? Tonight, we visit a Brexit derby. Stoke City hosted their neighbours Derby County. How does Stoke, where 69% of voters opted for Brexit, feel 2 years on? And what do they want from the Labour Party that represents them? David Grossman's been to Stoke to find out.
Stoke at home to Derby this evening, two Labour heartlands that voted enthusiastically for Brexit. Angela Smith is the official chairman of the Stoke Supporters Club and an unofficial Brexit supporter.
Do you get the sense that Stoke has, as a town, changed its mind, particularly since the referendum 2016?
No, in actual fact, I think people have become more entrenched in their views.
Why is that?
I feel that the way that people in Stoke have decided that the European Union have treated our ministers, I think it's made people from Stoke-on-Trent, certainly the people that I speak to, feel that we're better off out.
But what about today's reports from the Treasury and the Bank of England concluding we'd be much worse off after Brexit?
I'm not going to dispute anything that academic minds put forward. All I'm going to say is that the people of Stoke-on-Trent had their reasons for voting to leave, and a lot of those reasons were the fact that due to, in the opinion of people here, the economic union, people in Stoke were not getting the jobs they felt they should get, and nothing has changed from that point of view.
The menu at the concession stands doesn't change, but something that has appeared to shift today is Labour's enthusiasm for a second referendum. The Shadow Chancellor suggesting today that the party might support one.
Well, I wish I could believe they would, but I don't really know what the Labour Party are saying, getting very mixed messages off them. I mean, they're obviously opposing everything Theresa May does, but they're not, from where I'm looking at it, they're not offering any sort of alternative, which is very disappointing.
But if there was a second referendum, you would support that?
I would support it, and I would vote Remain again, definitely.
Do you think the fact that the Labour Party are suggesting that they might have a second referendum or might support a second...
No way. No, we've had a referendum. We don't want to go through all that again. The people have voted and that's it.
Can I ask which way you voted initially?
I voted to stay in initially, but I'm voting to get out now.
Is that what you would do in a second?
Definitely, no doubt about it.
Why?
Well, because they've walked all over us, haven't they? She's just let them walk all over us.
So, has the Labour Party here, do you think, been a bit conflicted?
Yeah, they've been very much following the party line.
But some in Stoke are delighted with Labour's apparent shift. Darren Clark is a Labour activist who is now campaigning for what he calls a people's vote. He says the Labour leadership is at last catching up with the membership.
It's very important. They're starting to speak about the language on the ground. It's really important to listen to their members, listen to the people. And I suppose I see they were always using the fact that there was a referendum already happening to respect democracy, but people's minds change all the time. Like, there's times in history in the UK government where they have changed their mind, where they went back on what was originally decided because it wasn't going to work. I feel like this is just going to be one of their times, but we need the people to decide that.
Has Stoke really changed its mind? Will Labour's move make any difference? All we can say for sure is things are moving very quickly.
I'm joined now by Shukura Muna, one of the Labour MPs who's been leading the charge for a second vote. We did ask a number of Labour MPs who disagree strongly with the idea of a second referendum to join us, but none of those we spoke to were able to come on the show tonight. Well, Shukura Muna, you saw in that report, I mean, there isn't the clamour out in the heartlands away from seats like yours, there isn't the clamour amongst Labour voters for a second referendum.
Well, look, there's no doubt about it that this whole Brexit issue has been a challenge for the Labour Party, because on the one hand you have seats like Stoke or, say, Sunderland, that local authority area, which voted in large numbers to leave, and seats like mine in Streatham, highest Remain vote in the country. And the challenge for us has been how to reconcile different points of view.
Now, they're unreconcilable, aren't they?
Well, I don't know about that. And in some senses, unwittingly, I think the Prime Minister has made this issue a little bit easier for all of us to deal with, because there's no doubt about it that people that I represent didn't want to see an extreme break from the European Union if it was to happen at all. They would rather that we weren't Brexiting at all. But equally, those in Leave voting areas didn't vote for the kind of Brexit that's been presented either, in the sense of we are going to be paying a £40 billion or more divorce bill, and yet we're not actually going to be getting anything in return. And the interesting thing with
a lot of those people think, well, just go for no deal then. They're quite, brazen about it.
Well, actually, a lot of people, and I did a lot of campaigning, at the behest of colleagues in other areas other than my own. I was in Merseyside, Lancashire, the West Midlands, Yorkshire during the general election last year. And talking to people, I certainly don't think they voted to be poorer. I think people did want to retain as many of the economic benefits we enjoy being members of the European Union whilst being outside. I don't deny that immigration was an issue, but what I have found has, in many respects, united increasing numbers of people in the party is when you look at the impact Brexit has already had. So, we've gone from being one of the fastest growing G7 economies to one of the slowest. Inflation has already made things more expensive. We've seen companies announcing they're going to move jobs back to the continent, particularly in manufacturing, which tends to often be in some of our industrialised, traditional labour areas. People look at that and they think, hang on just a minute, this is certainly not what I voted for, whether you voted Leave or Remain. And when
there was a lot of economic analysis before, though. There were a lot of forecasting done. People said it was Project Fear. They didn't believe it. They voted for Brexit. And they also were voting for things other than the economy. And I've spoken to plenty of people who said, I don't care if... Someone told me the other day, I don't care if you can't even afford a tea bag. I just want to get out. So they're not going to listen to this now.
I don't necessarily disagree with all of what you've just said, but I deliberately have mentioned current things that are already happening to the economy. I didn't even get into the forecasts which have come out today. And what we know from research and speaking to people is actually current stuff that's happening to the economy now, people sit up and listen to that, whereas forecast is often seen as Project Fear. And what I was going to say, the interesting thing with a lot of colleagues, I mentioned Sunderland, and, if you look at colleagues like Julie Elliott or Bridget Phillipson, who represent Sunderland, I've campaigned with them in their areas. Why are they, in spite of the fact it's a Leave voting area, arguing for a people's vote? Is because ultimately there are major dangers if you don't have a people's vote. And let me tell you...
But isn't the reality that a people's vote is pie in the sky? You're not going to get it through Parliament anyway.
Well, it completely depends, because what we see...
Second referendum, as I call it, obviously.
Well, I call it
a people's vote.
It's all right. Someone in your ears just told you that. But,
no, they haven't.
But, look, the point is this. If there is impasse in Westminster, and, I think there is a general consensus, we don't want to leave without a deal, but there is a lack of consensus of, well, what do you do instead? How else do you resolve it if not by referring it back to the people? And I think the big danger... But you're going to end up sliding in...
I mean, when would you accept? Would you ever accept, if it gets to February, you don't have a second referendum, and we're sliding into no deal or Theresa May's deal? How far do you take this to the wire?
Let's just be clear about one thing for everyone watching. I wish I could say to you that this Brexit thing that you're probably fed up with now is going to end, but actually it's just going to be the start of our negotiations on the future. And the big danger, I think, for Labour people is this. Look, we're going into this and we don't know what the future relationship's going to be. I think most people don't think there's going to be a general election. So whoever is the Tory Prime Minister, given that we don't know what we're going to, this is like a blindfolded thing. We are basically talking about giving this person, which is likely to be somebody from the right of the Conservative Party, they're waiting to get rid of Theresa May, a blank cheque to pursue whatever agenda they want in the negotiation on the future relationship.
You might end up going through the division lobbies with those kind of people and allow a no deal as opposed to... No, you would at some point pull back.
No.
You'd compromise. You're a sensible centrist politician. I'm sure that's how you bill yourself.
Well, look,
at some point, you'd have to compromise, wouldn't you?
What I would say is I don't accept that the executive can simply impose its will on the legislature in this case, and that Parliament isn't capable of stopping no deal. There is a variety of legal and political avenues to enable us to stop that from happening. And in the end, I do not want to give the next right-wing Prime Minister, and they're going to be much more right-wing than Theresa May if they're still in office, a blank cheque to run roughshod over people's rights at work, our NHS, consumer rights, environmental protections. That's the risk if you do not go for a people's vote, because it's the only way to settle this issue, in my view.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.